Welcome to Flourishment, the podcast on living life as you are meant to, so you can flourish. Welcome, everyone. I am super excited today. I have someone new on the podcast, Flourishment, today. Her name is Rachel Bruno. She's a writer and public speaker advocating for families that have been victims of the family court system. She shares her own powerful story, fighting the courts with a message of healing, hope, and faith. And she's here to talk to us today about keeping the shield of faith. Welcome, Rachel. I am so thankful that you came on Flourishment to share this important message today.
Thank you so much, Tina. My pleasure.
And I know it can be difficult dealing with Child and Family Services or Department of Children and Families, depending on where you live and what it's called. But the court systems, the legal systems, the people that are meant to protect our children, sometimes are doing their best, sometimes aren't well trained. They're spread really thin, and often the families and children that are meant to be protected end up getting victimized through that system. You have come through a terrific, horrible battle, both terrific and horrible at the same time, by maintaining your faith and strong prayers that you have put over yourself, over your children, over your family. And I'm excited to hear from you how that shield of faith protected you in this horrible battle that brought out a wonderful testimony. Can you talk to us today a little bit about what keeping the shield of faith means for you as a parent?
Yes, ma'am. So let's go back a few years, back in 2015, when this all happened. And basically, my infant son, then 7 weeks old, was critically injured in the care of his nanny. Now, she did not tell me what was wrong. She just showed me an empty bottle at 4 o'clock in the morning when he was screaming. And she told me she had just fed him and that he was really gassy. I said, okay, fair enough. Babies get gassy and they do scream like crazy. So at that point, I told her to go home and that I would take care of my son from there on. 6 hours later, my son would not nurse. My son would not nap. I could not lay him down. Like if I laid him down flat, he was just screaming. And if I picked him up and put him in like a burp position, he seemed to be okay. So, I was kind of jaded, gassy, colic, nursing strike. I knew something was wrong, but had really no idea what was wrong. So I called the pediatrician, asked if I could come in, and the receptionist said they wouldn't be available till 3 o'clock that afternoon. I said, he's been crying since 4 o'clock this morning. I need to see somebody now. He's not eating. He's not sleeping. I don't know what's wrong. So she said, okay, take him to the emergency room. So I called my mom to come with me because I had my 20-month-old son at the time, David. My husband was out of state on a business trip. So I was home alone with these two children. And we end up going to the hospital, and he sleeps on his way to the hospital. And I'm like, great, right? Overreactive mom going to the hospital. I get there, doctor lays him down. I tell him the symptoms, and the doctor just observes him. He walks away probably about 10 feet and just observes him for about a minute, like laser focused on the baby. And everybody in that room was quiet. I'm like, this is weird. And then he starts walking towards the bed, and he goes straight to my son's head right behind his left ear. Like, did you feel this? I said, no. So he grabs my hand, puts my finger there. Do you feel that bulge? I said, yeah. He's like, that's fluid that's leaking from his brain. And at that point, I'm like, okay, what does that mean? He's like, it could be spinal cerebral fluid. It can be blood. We need to go do a CT scan right now, see what's going on. And as soon as he says that, about 10 people rush into that room, and they start putting probes on him. They start putting tubes on him. They raise up the rails in the hospital bed, and they just start taking me down the hallway as I'm holding him. And as I'm holding him, his right arm starts twitching. And when that happens, those nurses bolt. And I look up, I'm like, is this normal? And she's like, no. Now, a little history about myself. I have epilepsy. I have seizures, which is why I had a nanny take care of my son at night. So when they see right arm twitching, left side of the brain, he's having a seizure. First thing that comes to my mind is, oh my God, I gave it to him, right? It's hereditary, it's genetic. God, please spare my son from having to live with this like I did. They take him to the room, the results come back. Doctors call me into the back room where all the monitors are. And he said, Mrs. Bruno, this is very serious. I'm like, okay. It's a cranial fracture and it's intracerebral blood hemorrhage. So the fluid that's leaking is blood. The brain hates blood. We need to go do emergency surgery right now. So, I have all this commotion going on, signing the liabilities. Are you against blood transfusions? Like, I don't care what you do to my son to save my son, save my son. And off they go with my 7-week-old baby into brain surgery. And I'm just in shock at this moment. I'm really in shock. I went from gassy baby to now he's in brain surgery. My husband is still out of state, no idea what's going on. I'm there with my mom and my 20-month-old son bouncing off the walls. And we're just texting everybody, our families in Brazil, our church friends all around the country. And we're like, everybody just start praying. I don't know what just happened, but my son is in the operating room, just pray. So we're in that silence, that moment of prayer. 4 hours later, the surgeon comes, says everything went well. Clinically, as far as we're concerned, we were able to drain the blood. We were able to fix the fracture. And my first question, of course, is he okay? Is he going to be brain damaged? And the doctor tells me we really don't know. Due to his young age, he's in a medically induced coma right now due to all the seizures he started having after the surgery. We don't know whether he's going to survive the next 48 hours. And again, I'm just receiving, it's like blow after blow after blow. I go into that PICU and I see what looks like a lifeless baby, right? His head wrapped in gauze, got tubes coming out of every orifice you can imagine. The machines are beeping. It's cold. When I go in there, I hold his hand. And I just remember praying. I said, God, if I have to dedicate the rest of my life to taking care of my son, I will. Just don't take him away from me. And at that moment, I felt, the words just came into my head. He's mine. And I breathed a sigh of relief, like, you're right, Lord, he is yours. And there is no better place for him to be than in your arms. So surrender my son to you, and he's yours. Now, the peace that surpasses all understanding entered that room, entered my heart at that moment. And I took a sigh of relief. My mom was there with my son. I went into mommy mode, programming mode. David is going to spend the night with you. Call my friend, pick him up, go home. He was happy as a doodle bug that he's going to spend the night at grandma's house. And I called my husband. He was on his way from the airport straight to the hospital. And while I waited for him, a man in a uniform and a lady with a clipboard came and knocked on my door. Now, if you've ever been in one of these intensive care units, everything is glass, like everybody can see you. So, they opened the door. Miss Bruno, can we speak to you? Sure. I thought it was weird. What's a police officer doing here? But first words out of his mouth were, what happened to your son was worse than getting hit in the head by a bullet. And I'm like, okay. Like, will you help us? Help you. We want to help you figure out how this happened to your son. And I'm like, of course. And I'm in my head, if he's asking me for help, he obviously knows it was the nanny, right? It wasn't me. So I sit down, tell them the whole saga from 4 o'clock in the morning. And the social worker asked me, do you have any other children? I'm like, I do. What are their ages? How old are they? Where are they? So I tell them my older son, David, 20 months old. He's spending the night at my mom's house. And she asked me, is it okay if we go see him? Like, at this point, I'm thinking I have nothing to hide, right? These people are here helping me. So I said, yeah, he's probably asleep by now. It was around 9 o'clock at night. And she said, we're not going to wake him. We just want to make sure he's okay. So I called my mom, tell her the social worker is coming, give the address. She leaves at that moment. And the police officer asked me if I will wait for the detectives, that the detectives were on their way. So we comply. My husband shows up. We are interviewed until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And remember, I'd been up since 4 o'clock in the morning the previous day. And I told the detectives, I'm like, I really need to go to sleep, right? I mean, I will continue this on later if you would like, but I need to sleep. So they were very nice to me, gave me their business cards. I went to bed. I wake up at about 10 o'clock and my husband is just staring at me with this blank face, blank look on his face. My first instinct is to look at my baby, like he's alive, what's going on? And he said, they took David. I'm like, what do you mean they took David? Who? Where? When? Like, we don't know. They won't answer the phone. We don't know where they are. Social services showed up with the police officers at your mom's house at 2 o'clock in the morning last night. And I call my mom. I'm like, what happened? Like, they came in here, they looked through the house, looked in the refrigerator, said there was food, went into David's room, which was my 20-month-old son, and asked me to turn on the light. Turn on the light. He woke up, happy, ready to play. Social worker asked me to undress him, and she inspected, for any signs of abuse. And she told my mom, there is, I don't see any signs of abuse, but we have to take him. My mom was like, no, you're not. And she said, if you don't give him to us, you're going to be arrested. And there were 3 police officers there with the cars outside, and they're on their walkie-talkies calling for backup. A lot of commotion going on. And my mom's like, if I go to jail, do I take him with me? And the social worker, no, he's going to go to foster care. And you're not going to be able to care for him because you will have a criminal record. So at this point, 2 o'clock in the morning, my dad is calling lawyers. My husband is on the phone with the social worker. I'm asleep at the hospital. All this going on. And when it came in the end, my mom felt like she had no choice. My son was getting antsy, noticing everything that was going on. So she gave my son to the social worker. And she drove off into the middle of the night without telling us where, why, what was going on. So we were all in shock, right? That next morning, my husband's calling social services. I'm calling lawyers. I had to call about 10 different lawyers until I found one that would speak to me. And I went into his office that day, that afternoon, and I'm like, where is my son and where do I go get him? And he told me, sit down. You have no idea what you're in for. I'm like, what are you talking about? They can't just come take my son. Like, yes, they can. I'm like, well, what? Speechless, like, based on what? And he's like, listen to me. What happened to your son was criminal. You are facing 15 years in jail, $100,000 bail if they decide to charge you. I'm like, I didn't do this. And he's like, I believe you. I'm like, well, what about the nanny? What about innocent until proven guilty? What about our Constitution? And he looks at me, this is family court. They don't follow constitutional law. And I'm like, what other law is there? It's like, they can do whatever they deem is in the best interest of your child. I'm like, how is it in the best interest of my child to take him from his grandma's house at 2 o'clock in the morning? And, he just cuts me off. He's like, listen to me. They are not giving your kids back to you. Okay, if your children are 2 years old and nonverbal, they can be legally adopted by the foster family if the case lasts longer than 6 months. And they will make it last longer than 6 months. I'm like, adoption? Like, without any proof, no, nothing? He's like, yes, they can. And I'm like, what country am I living in? Like, what is this? He said, your saving grace is that your husband was out of state when this happened. So legally speaking, he wasn't even at the crime scene. We're going to ask the judge to give sole custody to your husband. That way they don't even risk going into foster care. If the judge grants that, they're going to kick you out of the house. So at this point, what choice did I have? Go into that courtroom and fight for my rights and risk having my children being placed with strangers or having them be with their father. I mean, of course, give them to their dad, do whatever you want to me, but please leave my children out of this. So 3 days later, we have what they call the emergency hearing. And we are in a constant state of prayer, right? I have everybody in Brazil praying for me. I have missionaries in Africa praying for me. I have my whole church in the United States praying for me. And I just kept thinking, this is not going to happen. Like, my God is going to open these judges' eyes. This is not going to happen. And we get there to the courtroom, and I'm thinking it's going to be at least like Judge Judy, right? Judge here, you speak, you speak. And I never got to say a word in that courtroom. No, the nanny wasn't there. The social workers weren't there. The detectives weren't there. The police officers weren't there. The only person on trial in that courtroom was me. And the judge just goes around the room asking if there were any objections to placing the children with the father. Social services did object, which he then overruled. He said, children will be placed with their father. Mrs. Bruno, you have 24 hours to vacate your home. A caseworker will be contacting you regarding visitation. Court is adjourned. And again, I look at my mom. We just hug each other. We go out of that courtroom crying. bawling. And I look at my attorney and he's like, I told you this was going to happen. I'm like, I know. I can't believe this is happening. And I'm like, what next? He's like, you go get your stuff. You move out of your house. You do not leave one toothbrush in that house. And I was court ordered to take child abuse classes, parenting classes, individual counseling as part of what they call the safety plan in order to get my children back. So, at this point, you're guilty until proven innocent, basically. Parents are in there trying to prove their innocence. They never went after the nanny. They just assumed it was me, right? And in that child abuse class, I'm thinking, what the heck am I going to do in a child abuse class? I'm going to be in there with a bunch of drug addicts, alcoholics, domestic violence, tattooed, pierced up people, right? And when I get in that child abuse class, everybody was in the same boat that I was. And I'm like, why? Like, this does not make any sense. Why are these children being taken from these parents? There were bathtub accidents, there were playground accidents, there were teenagers that were posting naked pictures of themselves on Instagram. And a father disciplined his daughter. She called the police, he goes to jail, all the other kids get taken. So I'm witnessing all this, and when they kicked me out, I had nowhere to go. My whole family's in Brazil. I'm an only child. My mother was not allowed to have me with her because she was with my son when he was seized. So she was part of the criminal investigation as well. So she went to my church and she asked the pastor's wife to go pray for me. Pastor's wife came to pray, saw the state my husband was in, or my son was in. And she hugged me and she looked at me and she said, I've been praying and God told me you're coming home with me. Now I've known these pastors, they've been there. I've been there for about 4 years, hi bye every Sunday, but she basically, invited a stranger into her house. And when you start seeing God's hand in everything, right? You start seeing God's hand. I thanked her. I couldn't say thank you enough. I remember praying and asking God, okay, God, who sinned, right? That my son was born blind. Was it my mom? Was it my dad? Why is this happening to me? What did I do? And the Holy Spirit again to me, nothing, my daughter, nothing. This is just the evil world we live in. What you're witnessing right now is the destruction of the family, which is something that the devil has been plotting since the very day I created it. And your pain is not going to be in vain. I will use you. I will use this story. For now, just persist, trust me, and move forward. And from that point on, my perspective completely shifted. Right? I'm like, okay, so I know God is with me. All those little seeds that were planted since I was a little girl by my mom, even though I wasn't always receptive to them, would roll my eyes at my mom. Now, as a mom myself, all those Bible verses kept popping up in my mind every day. And there was a purpose now to this story. There was a purpose now to this pain. And I had the absolute faith and the security that my children were going to be okay, that this will pass. And my focus shifted from me to everybody in that child abuse class who didn't have God. I'm hearing all these stories of people losing their children, of retaliation, it was amazing. It was horrifying. It was terrifying. And I'm praying for these families daily and, rebuking the devil, because it really was evil what was happening to these families and to these children. So from that point on, I just had this fire in my butt. I'm like, I have to do something, right? I can't let it go, knowing everything that I know and everything that I've witnessed. People need to know this. Growing up in church, I always thought foster care was like Make-A-Wish Foundation, right? And that growing up in America, you always think innocent until proven guilty, trial by jury, all that stuff that we learn. And then I'm here and I'm like, none of that happened, right? And I start researching things. And when they took my son, David, at 2:00 in the morning, they took him to the county children's shelter, where he stayed there for 48 hours. And they wouldn't release him to me. They wouldn't release him to my husband. They ultimately released him to my mom because she was a public school teacher. So she was fingerprinted already in the system and a mandated reporter. When they did that, they asked her if she would adopt my kids. Now, before I even had a hearing, my mom is like, no, they give them back to their mom, to who they belong. And the social worker, well, we don't know what the judge is going to order at the hearing. So if he orders the removal of the children, will you adopt them? And I was like, what happens if I don't? Like, they'll go to foster care. My mom was like, okay. So she signs the papers and the social worker hands her 2 checks for $680 each. Like, they'll get $680 a month per child. They will be eligible for food stamps. They will be eligible for Medicaid. They will be eligible for WIC, all the social welfare benefits that we had in California. And my mom's like, I don't want your money. And the social worker said, well, this is how we help the families. So, there's a saying, when nothing makes sense, follow the money. And in doing some research and in that child abuse class, I learned so much from everybody else who was enthralled in the system. There's actually a law called the Adoptions and Safe Families Act that was signed by Bill Clinton in 1997, which gives federal funding to the states for every child that is placed in foster care and adopted. So the state gets anywhere from $2,000 to $8,000 a month per child. And there's currently about 435,000 children in foster care. So it's a big, big money making machine, right, for the government and for the agencies. And the social workers are really incentivized by this money, right? Not for reunification, but for placement. They call it placement, which is basically foster care or adoption. And if they're placed with family, they get less money than if they're placed with strangers.
That is a sickening number and a sickening statistic. I'm going to take a break for a second. And then when we come back, I cannot wait to hear the rest of your story and how it leads to a story of hope and promise for families from now forward, and for the things that you are doing to help make a difference in families from now on. First, I want to actually invite everyone to consider something that's going on right now that does make a difference in the lives of many families around the world. It's called Operation Christmas Child, and it's run by Samaritan's Purse. And this is a wonderful organization that actually does help families, and you can be part of that giving process through the Spark Network, the Christian Podcasters Network to which I belong. We are involved in helping support Operation Christmas Child by spreading the word, and we will leave you the links in the show notes so that you can find out more about how to connect with Operation Christmas Child. Perhaps you can donate funds for families so that they can support themselves when they otherwise would be struggling, or maybe that you and your family can participate in filling a shoebox and donating that so that your children can participate in missions and get to know what it means to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ in the world today. Now, let's get back to the story of Rachel Bruno. I know that all of you listening cannot wait to hear the end of this story, which isn't an end. It's a beginning of a mission of hope that Rachel Bruno has dedicated her life to. Rachel, tell us more about how you continue to pursue this and became an advocate for children and families, and how people can help support the protection of families in their own communities.
Yes. So as I witnessed, all this corruption really that was going on, I just prayed about it. And in that individual counseling session, I remember my court-appointed counselor, who was not a Christian, asking me how I was dealing with this, right? I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and now they're calling you a criminal. Like, how is this affecting your identity? And I thought about it for a while. I'm like, it really isn't affecting my identity. Yes, I'm a mom. Yes, I'm a wife. But first and foremost, I am the daughter of the Most High. And nobody can take that away from me. And she's jotting things down. It's like, okay, I guess that's a good way to look at it. Mm-hmm. So, that foundation that I had, to guard your heart and guard your mind so that you will not be deceived. Right. And even my lawyers, the attacks, my lawyer kept telling me every other day I was going to go to jail. He's like, you're lucky you didn't leave that hospital handcuffed. And I kept, God, am I going to go to jail? If it is, like, maybe there's somebody in that jail that needs to hear about you, that needs to hear about your message. And again, I say all these things, these did not come from me, right? These thoughts, these words, these feelings, that was all led by the Spirit, by the Holy Spirit, and the seeds that had been planted in me. And I say this to myself now as a mother, that whatever you are doing, whatever you are instilling in your children, the Bible tells us, lead them in the way, in the right path, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. I witnessed that, I lived that, and it is the absolute truth. And in praying for these families, I know, from foster care again, please remember that whatever they say, take it with a grain of salt. The Bible tells us to take care of the widow and the orphans. These children are not orphans. Okay, there are so many of them who do have family that are willing, that are able to take care of them. They just don't have the resources, the financial resources for attorneys. We probably went to about $250,000 in debt during this fight. And at the time that this all started, we were going to buy a house. So we had some cash for down payment, and that all went out the window when we were fighting this battle. So, if you see a child that seems like they are neglected, they have holes in their shoes, they haven't taken a shower in a few days, if you know that it's a single mother struggling, help that mother, right? The Bible tells us to love one another, to help each other, not to call the government. Because, once you do call the authorities, chances are that child is going to be taken away and they're never going to be reunited with their family again. And that leaves a gaping hole in your heart, in that child's heart, in that mother's heart forever. It really is. And it's a cycle, right? It's a vicious cycle that starts. I think even Secretary Pompeo said that 87% of the human sexual abuse victims in human trafficking were in the foster care system. Because, the people you're supposed to trust, your parents, right? They were just ripped away from you. And you're left vulnerable to believing whatever somebody who shows you any amount of attention is telling you. You're going to fall prey to that. So, help these women through nonprofit organizations, through your churches, with your time, with your prayers. Help them. This is how you would help them. And unless the child is in a life or death situation, right, I would not call CPS or social services. And my hope, throughout this whole thing, my son did survive those 48 hours. And when I was allowed to go back home, it was after 40 days and 40 nights, which is a very symbolic number for those of us who know. And the day that I was kicked out of my house, my church in Brazil, the pastor had everybody stand up in church, everybody point their hands towards the north, and started praying for my family. They began a fast that day. The church fasted for those 40 days. On the 40th day, we had a hearing. And my attorney tells me, don't even bother coming to court today. The status of your investigation hasn't changed. The criminal case is still open, so don't waste your time. I won't waste mine. I tell my husband says, I don't care what he says, we're going. So we go to the courthouse. An hour and a half later, he calls me, where are you? I'm at the courthouse. It's like, okay, might be able to do something. Then he hangs up on me. Shows up, I go hug him. He's like, don't hug me yet. I can't make you any promises. Okay, so he walks in and I'm there in the hallway. We're on our phones. Everybody start praying. Everybody start praying. I don't know what's going to happen. Something's going to happen. And he comes outside, he tells me, initial this, sign this, initial, sign. And I don't even know what I'm signing. I don't know what I'm initialing. I'm just trusting God at this point. And about 3 hours later, he comes back with a stack of papers, about 700 pages. He says, if you're willing to sign this document the way it's written, There's nothing in here admitting guilt. There's nothing in here saying that you did this. It's just the timeline of events. It's the police investigation. They are willing to let you go home today. Now, at this point, if they told me to cut off my leg, I would have done it. And I signed it, and he looked at me, and I've been doing this for 23 years. I have never seen them let anybody go home before trial. Like, you definitely have a higher power working for you. I said, yes, I do. Praise God. And I went home that day. And from that point on, our case remained open for about 6 months, where a social worker came to our house every week. And at the end of the 6 months, it was her recommendation that the case be closed. Our case was closed. So this was July of 2015. Our case was closed in February of 2016. And around April of 2017, we filed a civil suit against the county, the state, the sheriff's department, the social services, and the hospital. And we ultimately won. We settled in December of 2018 for $1.49 million. And, this wasn't for the money. There's no amount of money that could ever repay what they put us through. But I just wanted a clean slate, right? I told God when I started this, I'm like, we were going to buy our house, we were going to have everything, and now we're in the hole. I just want to start again. And, God granted us that. It was 3 years of depositions, of hearing every day that mom should have known. Like, why did they blame me? And that was always their response. Mom should have known. And I'm like, what should I have known? That I would cry, but again, protect your heart, protect your mind. And I'm like, God, I didn't know, right? I didn't know. And just having that Holy Spirit, my daughter, you're redeemed. You are redeemed. I know you. I know your character. Do not believe these fools. For I redeemed you, and you are with me, and your family is with me, and I will use you. So today, 6 years later, my son, who was 7 weeks old, had suffered the brain trauma, is in first grade, and he's thriving. No brain damage, no more seizures. He did go through 1 year of physical therapy, 1 year of anti-epileptic drugs, 3 reconstructive surgeries, but he's a miracle baby. And my son, David, is now 8 years old, third grade, thriving as well. I think he's the one who suffered most of the trauma, honestly, because he was old enough to remember. And when they took him to the children's shelter, to the county shelter, they gave him 13 vaccinations without our consent, without a court order. They forced him through a full skeletal survey, which is basically taking a picture of every bone in your body. They gave him an anal wink test, which is for sexual abuse, when there weren't even any allegations of sexual abuse. And we found all this out after discovery, after our civil suit, through suing them. Like, all this is sealed permanently in their records, which we wouldn't have access to until they were 18 years old. And my son was just not the same boy, right? When he did return home, he rejected me for probably about a year. And he kept telling me, I don't want you, mommy. I don't want you. I want to go live with my grandma, which is the one who rescued him, right? In his mind, she's the one who picked him up from the shelter, and I'm the one who abandoned him. And one day we were in that struggle, in that power struggle. I remember just going to the bathroom and crying. So I sit down with him and I ask him, you remember when your auntie had to come take care of you? This was my cousin who had to come from Brazil to take care of him. And first words out of his mouth, why did you leave? So at that point, I knew that he knew. And I showed him all the pictures of his brother. I'm like, this is what happened to your brother in the hospital. And they thought that mommy did this to him. And he looked at me, you never hurt us, mommy. Like, I know, but they thought that mommy did. And they thought they were doing their job, David. They just made a really bad choice. And he's like, where's the nanny? Is she in jail? And I'm like, I don't know. She's in God's hands. The Bible tells us to forgive. So we have to forgive her. We have to forgive the police officers. We have to forgive the doctors. We have to forgive the detectives. We have to forgive the social workers. We have to forgive everybody. And I prayed with him there. So we forgive them, okay? So we don't carry that bitterness in our heart. But We're not going to let them get away with it. We're going to fight. And he says, you're going to hit them, mommy? I'm like, yeah, we're going to hit them with a pile of papers. So we filed the civil suit. We took him to the post office when the papers came, and I showed it to him. I'm like, here it is, David. We're going to fight them. Okay, we're going to pray right now over all these pieces of paper. And remember that God is the judge. God is the final judge. All these people are in God's hands. So let's pray. And we prayed, we put it in the mail, and it was a complete 180 from that point forward with my son. You know, God restored all that the locusts had eaten away. So, you know, if you find yourself in that situation with family problems, family issues, if your children are hurt, if you're hurt, you know, have discernment, ask God for discernment to where to go, and do not listen to the lies. Do not listen to the devil. No, you're crazy. That's not God. You're making things up, right? Because I did hear those voices too. But the conviction of the Holy Spirit, always stronger. And just listen to it and follow it. And God is the God of miracles still today.
So glad to hear this story of miraculous triumph and that message that can happen to be an inspiration for those who are still in the midst of it, that haven't experienced triumph, that haven't experienced resolution and are still struggling, to keep their shield of faith and know that God is for them, that He is the judge, and that whether people see justice in this life or whether God brings justice in the eternal, He will bring justice and we can trust Him. So I appreciate you bringing that story to us today, Rachel. How can people continue to follow you and stay connected with you and find all the resources that you have to offer?
Yes, I have my own website, www.rachelbruno.com. And my book is going to be released. Right. I don't have an exact date, but it will be first quarter of 2022.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes. And it's called Fractured Hope. And, you know, I have told a lot of the story, but in the book, you will hear a lot of my heart, right? And a lot of the Bible verses, a lot of the things that happen throughout. So that's all on rachelbruno.com. You can follow me on Instagram is Rachel Bruno Speaks. And yeah, that's where I keep most of my stuff up to date. You know, if you need to contact me regarding anything in family law, any disputes, I'm not an attorney yet, but if you just need somebody to vent to, you know, if you need somebody to pray over you, I will definitely do that.
I love that so much. Thank you for coming on Flourishment today, Rachel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I hope that all of you listening really enjoyed Rachel Bruno's message and testimony and her story of hope and her offer to stay connected with you. And I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourishment.